So let's assume that a deal for Terry McLaurin gets done, in the next couple of months before training camp, sometime during camp. Let's just assume that that happens. What's next after that? This is an exercise that I went through last night that is very revealing of the roster. Now, not a lot of this is going to come as a big surprise to many of you, but it is interesting to kind of see what they've been doing here. They went into year one in this recalibration mode. Then they sort of recalibrated the recalibration by understanding they had gotten Jaden right, and they have sent a lot of draft picks, 8 in total for 3 players. They perhaps have been interested in a guy like Trey Hendrickson. But at the same time, when you consider this Terry deal, and then you're like, okay, well, what's next? What you start to get a picture of is what this roster is. This roster right now, first of all, did you know this? Did you know right now, of the 90 players that Washington essentially has under contract, heading into this summer, Washington's average age is the oldest in the NFL at 27.7 years old. That's according to Spot Rack, a big salary cap tracker, contract tracker. The next oldest team isn't even close at 26.9 years old. So there's an 8/10 of a difference between Washington at number one as the oldest roster right now. We don't know what the final 53 will look like, but right now they have the oldest 90 in the league. Now, Wagner and Ertz obviously skew that. So does Tress Way. Washington has 3 extraordinarily old players on their roster, and that helps, skew that very high, average that out very high. Is it a big deal? You know why it's not a big deal? Is that most of these players are on one-year deals. They could completely flip this next year by signing all young players. And that's where, when you start to look into what's next after Terry, it's just interesting. First of all, for those that don't know, and I've talked about this a lot, but if you're hearing this for the first time, they can't extend Jaden Daniels now. They can't go to him early and pay him. The collective bargaining agreement rules stipulate that draft pick contracts can't be renegotiated until the conclusion of a player's 3rd NFL regular season. So Jaden can't even be approached on a new deal until after the 2026 season, so after next year, which means the earliest Jaden could, have the truck backed up, in front of his house and end up being the highest paid player in the league, which is a distinct possibility when we get to the offseason of 2027. They can't do that until then. And by the way, they don't have to do it then. Remember, they have the 5th-year option on Jaden Daniels' rookie contract, which they can't exercise until the same moment in which they could actually offer him an extended deal, and that is the offseason of 2027. So all of their rookies that have been drafted in the last 2 years, you can't deal with until after next. For the guys that were picked in 2023, for the guys that were picked in 2024, not until after the 2026 season, and obviously for the guys that were picked this year, not until after the 2028 season. But what you start to see when you start to look towards like what's next, and you look at Washington's roster, is the way it's been constructed. I know we've talked a lot about this, but then you get into, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of where they are in paying players and finding those cornerstones of the franchise that they're going to pay and then build around? Well, again, number one is the quarterback. Can't touch him until 2027. Number 2 is somebody like Terry McLaurin, but he is getting into his 30s. We've talked a lot about that. And this is, an assumption that it gets done. What happens after Terry's deal? What's next? Jaden's still a couple of years away. What's next? Well, you have a lot of one-year contracts, right? A lot of guys on one-year deals, probably more than any team in the league in terms of one-year deals. By the way, that's been advantageous for the team as it relates to cash outlay, right? Because the aggregate value of these deals isn't significant when they're just one-year deals. That could play into what we talked about last hour about, are they hamstrung at all from a cash standpoint? I don't believe so, but I had somebody ask me as to whether or not that could be playing into the Terry McLaurin situation. But in terms of what's next after Terry, you look at the guys that are, first of all, probably worthwhile signing to contract extensions. So where do you go? You can't touch any of the rookies. You can't touch any of the second-year players. You can't touch any of the players. And really, when you look at the last two drafts, right, you're not touching anybody from the 24 draft until after the 26 season. Nobody from this draft until after the 27 season. And from the 23 draft, the only player really on the roster that you might have to deal with when this season is over, even though he's under contract for another year, would be Quan Martin. If Quan Martin blows up into a big-time player this year, he would be entering the final year of his rookie deal. And remember, there's no fifth-year option on him because he was not a first-round pick. But, take him out of the equation because we don't know what he's going to be like. You're really then talking about the guys who are among the highest-paid players on the team right now. Laramie Tunsil. Laramie Tunsil is 31 years old, but Laramie Tunsil's contract runs out after the 2026 season. You just traded a lot of draft capital for the guy that you believe will be your starting left tackle during this first window of Super Bowl contention with Jaden under a rookie deal. Is that just 2 more seasons of Tunsil? Doubt it. I'm sure, because that pit position has aged pretty well. Certainly into your mid-30s, you can play at a very high level. Tunsil's probably next. This time next year when the season ends, because you can start signing your own once the season ends. You don't have to wait for, March, the league calendar to begin. I would say that Tunsil is probably the next big deal they have to worry about. Who else? Well, if Duran goes out and has a big year, he's going to, he's got to view this as kind of a contract year like he had, in 2022, because he's got 1 year left on his deal after this year. But it is a major cap hit savings if they were to release him after this year or trade him after this year. He could meet John Allen's fate if he does not have a big year. Keep in mind, Deron Payne is entering his age 28 season. Deron Payne still could prove to be a big-time player with a season this year. I know all of us would be talking about, right? If he goes out and has 10.5, 11.5 sacks and ends up being a dominant player like he was in 2022, we would all be sitting here saying it's not worth paying him because we see what happens when he's not, in a contract year. But it's very possible, given his age, if he performs at a high level in 2025, that he would be on the list next year because he'd have only 1 year remaining on his deal. Now, they may, with a guy like Duran, say, no, we're going to make you play out that final year on the deal. But they may have compelling reasons to extend him and to get some cap savings benefits next year. By the way, Washington, because of all of their 1 year deals, are in great cap position heading forward. They're top 5 for the next 3 years in available cap space. And that's because they have all of these 1 year contracts. Who else would be on the list? I'll give you a guy, Frankie Louvu. Frankie Louvu at 29 years old, if he has another season like he had last year or even better in 2025, he does have 1 year left on his deal in 2026, but it might be one of those situations that they would look to extend him before 2026. That's a possibility. A Dorrance Armstrong is sort of in the same boat. A Tyler Biotish is still in the same boat. Those were guys that signed 3 year deals, so they've got another year after this one. But if they end up playing at a high level and the team thinks they're worth keeping, you figure it out and get it done next off season. But what this really reveals when you go through this like they paid Cosme last year. They obviously a guy like Kinlaw this year. They extended Bates, remember. Allegretti's still got a year left on his deal. But, when you look at their roster, it's significant change year to year because of all of these one-year deals. Now, they ended up bringing back several of their one-year guys. Wagner, Ertz, Igbenogany. I'm forgetting somebody. They also let a bunch of one-year guys walk, Crowder and others they let walk after one-year deals last year. Their slot receiver from the Falcons, they let walk. Zacchaeus, they let walk. They let somebody else walk that I'm forgetting. But they brought back, a guy like McNichols. They brought back, as I said, Wagner and Ertz. A lot of their, roster in terms of players that are under contract beyond next year are all rookies. That's a good situation to be in, to have some control over your young players. But, man, you look at this roster, and there aren't a lot of so-called cornerstone contracts. Terry's will be one. Tunsil's will be one. And, obviously, Jaden's contract will be one. But after that, not many. They're going to have to, turn the next cornerstone contracts out of the players they've drafted. Connerly Jr., but that's down the road. A guy like Amos, certainly a guy like Sanders still, who is proven, after 1 year to be a guy that we will be keeping our eye on in terms of getting a big contract down the road. You'd certainly hope that Johnny Newton would emerge into a really good player that you could, get excited about paying. By the way, that, potential off season is one of the reasons you can't be going crazy with a player that's entering his 30s right now. Because in 2027, January of 2027, you'll have Jaden, you'll have Sanders still, and you may have Johnny Newton. You may have a guy like Brandon Coleman that you want to keep because he's established himself as a really solid guard in the league. So there's going to be a lot, going down the road. But as of now, when you look at what's next after Terry, it gives you an idea that the roster is not loaded with cornerstone players at this point. They may be coming, and we certainly have one at quarterback. But they're in good shape too. That's the benefit of all these one-year deals is they've got plenty of cap flexibility. They've become a place that doesn't turn people away. They've actually become a magnet for players. So they'll have a lot of flexibility moving forward. I don't know. I thought it was, just the idea that this Terry deal gets done and then it's what's next? Really, the big one is Jaden's. But this time next year, Tunsil will have to get paid. If he ends up being the player that they think they got in the trade, hopefully a quicker answer to that than they got with Marshawn Lattimore. I didn't even mention Lattimore. Lattimore counts very little cap-wise and payment-wise for the next couple of years. So it's not a bad situation, but that also means that it's not, a situation that they'd be afraid to run from, if they, kind of ultimately determine he was not the player they thought they had traded for.